Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. It started as a faint sound, so soft I barely registered it the first night. A repetitive knocking, or perhaps a faint whistle, just outside my house. I dismissed it as the wind or an animal brushing against the siding. My street was quiet at night, surrounded by tall trees that often creaked and groaned in the breeze. It was nothing unusual, or so I told myself. The next night, it happened again. Around the same time, just after midnight, the noise began. 3 faint knocks, followed by a whistle-like sound, then silence. I paused whatever I was doing to listen, trying to pinpoint the source. It seemed to come from the side of the house, near the living room window. I got up to investigate, peering through the blinds. The porch light cast a faint glow, but the yard beyond was shrouded in darkness. Nothing moved. No signs of anyone or anything. I stood there for a moment longer, listening, but the noise had stopped. Shrugging it off, I returned to my routine, though the sound lingered in my mind longer than it should have. By the 4th night, I was on edge. The noise had become a nightly occurrence, always around the same time, always the same pattern. 3 knocks, a whistle, silence. I stayed up late, waiting for it, sitting in the dim glow of my living room lamp, with the blinds partially open. The anticipation was worse than the noise itself. When it finally came, my heart jolted in my chest. The same sound, the same maddening regularity. I sprang up and flicked on the porch light. Grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, I stepped outside, determined to find the source. The air was cold, the kind of chill that settles deep into your skin. I swept the flashlight across the yard, the beam catching the edges of bushes and the fence that bordered my property. Nothing. The wind rustled the trees, a hollow, almost mocking sound. I turned back toward the house, glancing over my shoulder one last time before locking the door behind me. It had to be the wind, I told myself. What else could it be? Still, that night I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every distant rustle outside made my skin crawl. I told myself I was imagining things, but deep down I wasn't so sure. The noise came again the next night, sharper and more deliberate. I froze in my chair, heart pounding. This time it was unmistakable. Someone or something was outside. Gathering every ounce of courage, I grabbed the flashlight and moved cautiously to the window. As I parted the blinds, my breath caught in my throat. A figure stood on the side of the house, partially hidden in the shadows. They were still, unnaturally so, their head tilted slightly as if they were listening. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the faint glow of the porch light. My stomach turned cold as the figure shifted, realizing they'd been seen. Without a sound, they turned and bolted, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, frozen, the flashlight trembling in my hand. It took me several minutes to move, to convince myself that they were gone. When I finally stepped outside, my flashlight beam revealed nothing but the empty yard. No footprints, no sign of anyone, just the oppressive silence of the night. I locked every door and window before retreating to my bedroom, though I knew sleep wouldn't come. I spent the following day in a haze, replaying the events in my mind. Maybe it was a prank, a teenager trying to scare the neighborhood, or maybe it was something worse. The thought gnawed at me, refusing to let go. That night, the noise returned. It started faintly, as always, but this time it was accompanied by a louder, unmistakable thud. Something, or someone, was in the yard. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously opened the back door. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I stepped out anyway, sweeping the flashlight across the yard. For a moment, there was nothing. And then I saw it. A piece of paper, folded neatly, lying near the side of the house where the figure had stood the night before. My hand shook as I picked it up, the paper crinkling loudly in the stillness. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, but the message was chillingly clear. This house doesn't belong to you. Leave. I stared at the note, my mind racing. Who had left it? What did they mean? My house was mine. I had lived here for years without incident. But the certainty in those words made me doubt myself, made me question everything. I retreated inside, locking the door behind me and shoving the note into a drawer. My hands trembled as I double-checked the locks and pulled the blinds tight. Whatever this was, it wasn't over, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face what might come next. For the first time in nights, the sound didn't come. No knocks, no faint whistle, no strange disturbances in the yard. The silence should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It felt intentional, as if the absence of noise was a message in itself. I stayed up late, waiting, straining to hear even the faintest disturbance. I paced the living room, my nerves wound tight as a spring. Every creak of the house made me jump. The heater kicking on startled me so badly that I nearly dropped my coffee mug. But the night remained quiet, unnervingly so. It was as if the world outside had gone dormant. Even the wind, which usually rattled the windows, was still. The quiet pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, amplifying my unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though every glance out the window revealed only darkness. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept, hadn't moved from my vigil by the window. The sunlight should have brought comfort, but it didn't. I felt hollow, my nerves frayed from the waiting. I couldn't decide what was worse, the noise or the silence. Days passed without incident. No noise, no figure, no note. Life seemed to return to normal, though the memory of those nights clung to me like a shadow. I tried to convince myself it had been a prank, a string of unrelated events that my imagination had woven into something sinister. People could be cruel, I reasoned. Maybe someone had seen me react and decided to push my buttons. I busied myself with work and errands, trying to distract myself from the lingering unease. I stopped checking the windows obsessively, and even left the house for an evening walk, something I hadn't done since the figure had appeared. But the house no longer felt like a sanctuary. Each night, as I locked the doors and turned off the lights, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the edge of the darkness. I started sleeping with a light on in the hallway, a small concession to the fear I wouldn't admit to anyone. I told myself I was overreacting. The rational part of me knew there was no real threat, but that didn't stop me from waking up in the middle of the night, heart racing, certain that something had changed. Each time, I'd check the windows and find nothing, only the quiet yard and the empty street beyond. One night, weeks after the last incident, I woke suddenly. My heart was pounding, though I didn't know why. The house was quiet, the air inside heavy and still. For a moment I stayed in bed, trying to calm myself, but the unease was overwhelming. I got up, moving cautiously to the window. The yard was empty, just as it had been every other night since the note. But something felt different. The shadows seemed darker, the edges of the yard more indistinct. I stared out into the night, waiting for something, anything, to move. Nothing did. The silence was absolute, so complete it felt unnatural. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My skin prickled, and I stepped back from the window, pulling the curtains closed. I stayed awake for hours, my eyes fixed on the sliver of light beneath the door, listening for a sound that never came. When morning arrived, the fear felt distant and irrational, like a bad dream I couldn't fully recall. I told myself I had imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But a part of me knew better. Time passed, and life returned to its routine. The knocks, the whistles, the figure, they never came back. The house was quiet, its familiar creaks and groans settling into a rhythm that no longer made me jump. I stopped looking over my shoulder, stopped checking the yard every night. The house was warm and inviting, the kind of place that felt like a sanctuary from the world outside. I was staying with a relative, someone I hadn't seen in years, but who had always been kind to me. Their home was meticulously kept, filled with little touches of personality, family photos, carefully arranged bookshelves, and the faint scent of lavender from a diffuser in the corner. It didn't take long for me to notice the locked door. At first, it was just a passing curiosity. The door, tucked away at the end of a hallway, was unremarkable, painted the same soft beige as the rest of the house. But unlike the other rooms, this one never opened. I didn't think much of it until, one evening, I heard something faint coming from behind it. A soft tapping, almost rhythmic, followed by a dragging sound. It stopped as quickly as it had started. I paused, tilting my head toward the door, but the noise didn't come again. Shaking my head, I dismissed it as the house settling, or perhaps the distant sound of the TV from the living room. Still, the door lingered in my mind longer than I expected. A few days later, I found myself alone in the house while my relative ran errands. My gaze drifted down the hallway to the locked door, and I couldn't resist walking over to it. I leaned in, pressing my ear against the smooth surface. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, faintly, a soft scratching sound emerged from within. I jumped back, heart racing. It was so subtle it could have been anything, a mouse, maybe, or even my imagination. But it was there. That evening, I worked up the nerve to ask about it. We were sitting in the kitchen, sharing a simple dinner, when I casually brought it up. "What's in the locked room at the end of the hall?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. My relative froze for just a fraction of a second, their fork halting midway to their mouth. They quickly recovered, shrugging as though the question was unimportant. "Oh, just storage," they said. "It's full of old stuff I don't use anymore." "But I thought I heard," I started, but they cut me off. "Nothing's in there. Don't worry about it." Their smile was tight, and their tone carried an edge I hadn't heard before. "You shouldn't go near it. There's nothing to see." They were asleep, their breathing deep and steady. I stepped inside, my heart pounding as I approached the small dresser by the bed. I opened the top drawer as quietly as I could, rummaging through its contents until I found a small brass key. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. But as I turned to leave, the key slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor. The sound was deafening in the silent room. My relatives stirred, their breathing hitching as they woke. Their eyes opened, and for a moment we just stared at each other, the realization dawning in their expression. "What are you doing?" they asked, their voice sharp with suspicion. I stammered an excuse, but it was useless. They snatched the key from the floor and stood, their presence suddenly towering, oppressive. "Go to bed," they said coldly, their tone leaving no room for argument. I obeyed, retreating to my room with my heart in my throat. I lay awake for hours, wondering if I'd ever get another chance to see what was behind the locked door. The next morning, the tension in the house was palpable. My relative barely spoke to me, their usual warmth replaced by a cold, guarded demeanor. Over breakfast, they avoided eye contact, their movements stiff and deliberate. The atmosphere was suffocating, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that they were watching my every move. When I tried to bring up the previous night, they cut me off sharply. "You crossed a line," they said, their voice low but laced with anger. "I told you to leave that room alone." I tried to apologize, to explain my curiosity, but they weren't having it. "It's not your business," they snapped, their eyes narrowing. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." The words sent a chill through me. What could be so important or dangerous that they would react this way? I wanted to press them for answers, but their rigid posture and cold gaze warned me not to push further. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. My relatives stayed close, their presence an unspoken warning to keep my distance from the locked room. I could feel their suspicion hanging over me like a dark cloud, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I wasn't just being watched, I was being monitored. Their reaction felt off, and I couldn't help but notice how their eyes flicked toward the hallway, as if to make sure the door was still closed. I didn't press further, but the exchange only fueled my curiosity. The noises from the room continued sporadically over the next few nights. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but once I noticed them, I couldn't stop listening. A light tapping one night, a faint dragging sound the next. Always late in the evening, when the house was quiet and my relative was in their bedroom. Each time I got close to the door, the noises would stop. It was almost as if whatever was inside knew I was there. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't shake my curiosity. My relative's behavior became increasingly odd. They always seemed to know when I was near the door, appearing suddenly with some excuse to steer me away from it. "Let me show you something in the garden," they'd say. Or, "I thought I heard something outside." Their vigilance was unnerving, as though they were guarding something far more important than old junk. The locked room felt like a weight pressing down on the house. Every time I walked past it, my eyes lingered on the doorknob, my mind racing with possibilities. What could they be hiding? And why did it feel like the room was watching me as much as I was watching it? It happened late one night, after I heard a particularly loud noise from the room. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor, followed by a low thud. I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening as I strained to hear more. The house was silent again, but the sound had been unmistakable. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know. I slipped out of bed, the floorboards creaking softly under my feet as I made my way down the hall. The locked door loomed ahead, bathed in the faint glow of the nightlight plugged into the wall. I reached out, testing the doorknob, but it didn't budge. Locked, as always. My gaze drifted toward my relative's bedroom. They had to have the key. I hesitated, torn between the fear of getting caught and the overwhelming need to uncover the truth. Finally, I crept to their door, pushing it open just enough to see inside. By the following morning, it was clear that my time in the house was coming to an end. Over breakfast, my relative finally broke the silence, their tone unnervingly calm. "I think it's best if you leave," they said, not looking up from their coffee. "I've enjoyed having you here, but I think you need to go home." The words hit me like a blow. There was no mistaking the finality in their voice, no room for negotiation. I nodded mutely, knowing that any attempt to argue would only make things worse. My curiosity had pushed too far, and now I was being shut out completely. As I packed my things, I couldn't help but steal one last glance at the locked door. It loomed at the end of the hallway, silent and unmoving, its secrets still hidden behind that impenetrable barrier. I felt a pang of regret, but there was nothing more I could do. When I left, my relative's goodbye was brief, almost dismissive. They stood on the porch, watching me go with an expression I couldn't quite read, part anger, part relief, and something else I couldn't name. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching, their eyes boring into the back of my car. Even after returning home, the events at my relative's house stayed with me. The locked door, the faint noises, the cryptic warnings, all of it replayed in my mind like a loop I couldn't break. I found myself obsessing over the possibilities. What could they have been hiding? Was it something mundane, like old family secrets? Or was it something darker, something that defied explanation? I considered calling them, asking for answers, but I knew it would be pointless. They'd made it clear that the subject was off limits, and pushing them further would only drive a deeper wedge between us. Still, the questions gnawed at me, refusing to let go. I even toyed with the idea of going back, of finding some excuse to visit again and finally uncover the truth. But the memory of their anger, the coldness in their eyes, was enough to dissuade me. Whatever was behind that door, they were willing to go to great lengths to protect it. The day had been uneventful, like most others. I spent my evening catching up on a series before heading to bed. The air outside was calm, and the occasional rustle of leaves was the only sound cutting through the quiet. My house sat at the end of the street, surrounded by a tall fence and a few trees that cast long shadows under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was the kind of ordinary, uneventful night I'd grown accustomed to in this neighborhood. As I turned off the living room lights and walked toward my bedroom, something caught my eye. The curtain by the window moved. It wasn't much, a slight shift, as though disturbed by a soft breeze. But the window was closed, and no draft could have come through. I paused, staring at the curtain. That's when I saw it, a faint silhouette behind the fabric. For a moment, I couldn't move. My heart pounded as I stood frozen, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. Finally, I mustered the courage to pull the curtain back. Nothing. The street outside was empty, and the window reflected only my uneasy face staring back at me. I checked the lock. It was secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. I went to bed that night telling myself I'd imagined it, but sleep didn't come easily. The days that followed were marked by an undercurrent of unease. I tried to forget the incident with the curtain, but my mind kept drifting back to it. Small things started to nag at me. My keys weren't on the counter where I usually left them. A picture frame on the shelf seemed slightly crooked. At first, I dismissed these as harmless lapses in memory, but the sense of being watched grew stronger, especially at night. I started noticing faint sounds, creaks in the floorboards, as though someone was moving through the house. The air felt heavier, almost oppressive, and there were moments when I'd turn suddenly, convinced someone was standing behind me. Of course, there was no one. It was irrational, I told myself. I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But that didn't make the feeling go away. One evening, I found a chair in the dining room slightly pulled back from the table. I hadn't touched it. It wasn't the kind of thing I'd notice normally, but in that moment, it felt like a warning, a quiet, unspoken message that I wasn't alone. The first time it happened, I woke up gasping. It was the middle of the night, and my arm felt cold, as though someone had brushed against it. My eyes darted around the room, heart pounding. The curtains were still, the room dimly lit by the glow of a street lamp outside. Nothing seemed out of place. Still, the sensation lingered, the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat up, scanning every corner of the room. The shadows seemed to shift, but I couldn't trust my eyes. My breathing was shallow as I got out of bed and checked the window, then the closet, then under the bed. There was nothing there, just silence and the faint hum of the heater. Still, I couldn't convince myself everything was fine. My skin crawled with a deep, instinctive unease, and it took hours before I managed to drift back to sleep. This wasn't the only night it happened. Over the next week, I woke up multiple times, always with the same sensation. Sometimes it felt like someone had touched my arm or shoulder. Other times, it was just a suffocating awareness of being watched. Each time I would search the room, but there was never anything to find. Sleep became something I dreaded. By now, the feeling of being watched was almost constant. During the day, I could distract myself with work and errands, but as soon as the sun went down, the house seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and the creaks and groans of the house felt deliberate, purposeful. I'd hear faint sounds, a soft tap against the wall, the scrape of something shifting across the floor, and I could no longer dismiss them as the house settling. One night, as I sat in the living room, I noticed the temperature drop sharply. I could see my breath in the air, even though the heater was on. I tried to brush it off, but the sensation of being watched was so overwhelming that I had to leave the room. I went to bed early that night, but sleep didn't come. Hours later, as I lay staring at the ceiling, I heard a faint whisper, so quiet I couldn't make out the words. It was coming from the corner of the room. I refused to look. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but I stayed frozen under the covers, barely breathing. Eventually, the sound stopped. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream, but I knew deep down that it wasn't. I tried everything I could think of to restore some sense of normalcy. I rearranged the furniture, hoping a fresh layout would make the house feel less oppressive. I burned candles, played music, and left the lights on in every room at night. None of it worked. The disturbances continued, subtle but insistent. A tapping noise would come from the walls, always behind me. Shadows seemed to linger in corners where no light could reach. Even when nothing happened, the atmosphere felt thick with anticipation, as though something unseen was waiting. One night, as I was locking the doors before bed, I glanced toward the window in the living room. My breath caught. For a brief moment, the silhouette was back, standing behind the curtain. This time I didn't move. I stood rooted to the spot, staring at it, heart hammering in my chest. The shape didn't move, but its presence felt deliberate, as though it wanted me to know it was there. When I finally summoned the courage to pull the curtain back, I found nothing but an empty street and my own reflection staring back at me. The realization hit me then. This wasn't something I could fight or reason with. Whatever was in my house, it didn't belong to the world I understood. It was beyond me, and I felt powerless against it. The sleepless nights began to take their toll. My thoughts felt foggy, my body heavy. I struggled to focus at work, and even simple tasks became insurmountable. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shadow felt like a threat. I started avoiding certain rooms entirely, especially the living room where I'd seen the silhouette. Even in my bedroom, where I should have felt safest, the sense of being watched was constant. I couldn't escape it. One night, I woke up again with that familiar sensation, cold and clammy, like a hand had brushed against my arm. This time it was worse. The pressure lingered, and I felt the mattress dip slightly, as though someone was sitting at the edge of the bed. My breath caught in my throat as I lay perfectly still, too afraid to move. The presence was unmistakable. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. After what felt like hours, the weight on the mattress disappeared, and I dared to turn on the light. The room was empty, as always. But that was the moment I knew I couldn't stay here anymore. My home had turned into something unrecognizable, a place where I was no longer welcome. The decision to move wasn't easy, but it felt like my only option. I couldn't keep living like this, teetering on the edge of fear and exhaustion. I packed my belongings hastily, not caring about organization or what I might leave behind. Every time I turned my back, I felt eyes boring into me. The walls seemed to close in, the house growing colder with every passing hour. On the last night before I left, the silhouette appeared again. This time, it was in the hallway, standing perfectly still. I didn't try to confront it. I turned away and locked myself in the bedroom, heart racing, waiting for dawn. When morning came, the house was quiet, but the silence felt menacing, like the calm before a storm. I loaded the last of my things into the car and didn't look back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the silhouette standing in the doorway, watching me leave. The house shrank into the distance, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. But the relief was short-lived. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I still felt watched, even miles away. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that made every sound echo louder than it should. I had decided to go for a walk, something I often did to clear my mind. The streets were familiar, a network of paths I'd tread countless times. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, their dim orange glow creating an eerie but comforting atmosphere. The air was crisp, with a faint breeze carrying the scent of damp leaves. My footsteps fell into a steady rhythm, accompanied only by the occasional rustle of trees or the distant hum of a car passing on the main road. It felt peaceful, a rare moment of solitude in an otherwise chaotic life. As I turned onto a quieter street, I became aware of another presence. At first, it was just a shadow far ahead, too indistinct to give much thought. But when I glanced back a few moments later, the figure had moved closer, keeping to the opposite side of the street. Their movements mirrored mine, not hurried, not lingering, just steady. I shook off the flicker of unease, telling myself it was nothing. People walked at night all the time, especially in a neighborhood like this. Still, I couldn't help but glance back again, my gaze lingering on the shadowy form trailing behind me. As I continued walking, I became increasingly aware of the figure. They kept the same distance, never speeding up or slowing down. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the familiar surroundings, the row of houses with darkened windows, the occasional flicker of a porch light. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the stranger. I quickened my pace slightly, testing to see if they would do the same. They did. The steady rhythm of their footsteps echoed faintly, just far enough away to make it unnerving. Every few steps, I stole a glance over my shoulder, each time hoping they would have turned down another street or stopped. But they were always there, maintaining that unnervingly perfect distance. The air felt heavier now, the once comforting quiet of the night turning oppressive. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it just a coincidence, someone heading home the same way as me? Or was it something else, something darker? I told myself not to be paranoid. There was no reason to assume the stranger was following me. And yet, every instinct screamed otherwise. By the time I reached the small square at the center of the neighborhood, my nerves were frayed. The square was empty, its benches illuminated by a single flickering streetlight. I decided to sit, hoping the stranger would pass by and prove me wrong. I chose a bench with a clear view of the street I'd just walked down, my eyes fixed on the path ahead. The figure appeared moments later, stepping into the glow of the streetlight at the far end of the square. I watched intently, my breath catching in my throat as they continued walking. For a moment it seemed they were heading straight toward me. Then, without warning, they turned. They veered into a narrow alley to the right, vanishing from sight. Relief flooded through me, though it was tinged with unease. I told myself it was over. they weren't following me. It had all been a strange coincidence. I stayed on the bench for several minutes, letting the tension drain from my body. The night felt calm again, the square quiet and still. When I finally stood to leave, I felt foolish for letting my imagination get the better of me. I began walking again, convinced the stranger was long gone. The relief didn't last long. I had barely gone 2 blocks when I felt it again, that unmistakable sense of being watched. My skin prickled, and my steps faltered as I glanced back. My heart sank. The figure was there, further back this time, but unmistakably present. They emerged from the shadows of a side street, their movements deliberate but unhurried. I couldn't make out any details, just the dark outline of a person, their features obscured by the dim light. Panic flared, and I quickened my pace. My footsteps echoed louder now, a frantic rhythm against the quiet streets. The stranger didn't match my speed this time, but they didn't fall behind either. They kept their distance, always there, always watching. I turned down a different street, hoping to lose them. For a few moments, I thought I had. The road ahead was empty, the only sound the rush of my own breathing. But when I glanced back again, the figure was there, standing at the corner I had just turned. My pulse thundered in my ears as I forced myself to keep walking. I didn't dare stop again, didn't dare give them another chance to disappear and reappear like a shadow come to life. My pace quickened into a near jog, but the figure remained at the same steady distance, never speeding up, never falling behind. The streetlights above cast long, wavering shadows across the pavement, making it feel like the entire street was shifting under my feet. Every few steps I glanced back, hoping, praying that the figure would finally be gone. They weren't. They didn't even try to hide anymore. Their silhouette was clear against the faint orange glow of the streetlights, walking with an unnerving steadiness. My breath came faster, the air feeling colder now, sharper, like it carried some unseen weight. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this some sort of game, a cruel prank, or something worse? The empty streets amplified my fear. There was no one else out, no cars passing, no lights in the windows of the houses I passed. It was just me and the figure, a silent, relentless presence that felt more like a predator than a person. I turned sharply at the next corner, then another, weaving through the streets in an attempt to lose them. My heart pounded as I finally darted down a side alley, the dim light barely illuminating the cracked asphalt and overflowing trash bins. I crouched behind one of the bins, pressing my back against the cold metal as I struggled to steady my breathing. For a moment, there was only silence. Then I heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing faintly in the distance. They were closer than I had hoped. My pulse raced as I pressed myself tighter against the bin, my body trembling with the effort to stay silent. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. I held my breath, waiting. But after what felt like an eternity, the sound faded, replaced by the oppressive stillness of the alley. I didn't dare move right away, my body frozen in fear. When I finally peeked out from behind the bin, the alley was empty. The figure was gone, or so I thought. I emerged cautiously, my legs unsteady as I stepped back onto the main street. The sudden openness felt both a relief and a risk. My eyes scanned every shadow, every corner, but the figure was nowhere in sight. Maybe I'd finally lost them. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were near, lurking just out of view. I turned toward a familiar route, one that would lead me home through well-lit streets and past landmarks I knew by heart. My breathing slowed slightly as I convinced myself the worst was over. But then, as I rounded a corner, I saw them again. They stood at the far end of the street, perfectly still, silhouetted against the glow of a distant streetlight. My stomach twisted in knots as I realized they had somehow anticipated my path, appearing ahead of me instead of behind. I froze, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, they stepped back into the shadows, disappearing once more. I turned and ran. My legs burned as I sprinted down the street, my surroundings blurring into indistinct shapes. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to escape. My only focus was putting as much distance as possible between me and that figure. I eventually found myself on a wide, familiar avenue leading toward a small convenience store that stayed open late. Its fluorescent lights spilled onto the sidewalk, a beacon of safety in the otherwise darkened neighborhood. My pace slowed as I approached, the sight of the store calming the frantic drumbeat of my heart. But then, as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw them again. They stood at the far edge of the avenue, just beyond the reach of the store's lights. Their figure was barely visible now, blending almost seamlessly into the shadows. But they were there, watching, waiting. For a moment, I thought they might step forward, closing the distance between us. Instead, they turned and walked away, their silhouette fading into the darkness until it was gone completely. I stared after them, my mind racing, unable to make sense of what had just happened. I stepped into the convenience store, the harsh fluorescent lighting feeling alien after the oppressive darkness of the streets. The cashier barely looked up as I made my way to the counter, my legs shaky beneath me. I didn't buy anything, I just needed to be around people, to feel the safety of their presence. After a few minutes, I ventured outside again, scanning the street for any sign of the figure. There was none. The avenue was empty, its silence broken only by the occasional rumble of a distant car. The rest of the walk home was uneventful, but the relief I felt upon reaching my door was overwhelming. I locked it behind me, double-checking every latch and bolt before finally collapsing onto the couch. It was late afternoon, the streets buzzing with activity as I walked home from running errands. The air was crisp and the hum of conversations, distant car horns, and footsteps filled the atmosphere. I was passing by a small plaza when a man ran past me, almost knocking into my shoulder. He was moving fast, his head darting around as if searching for something or avoiding someone. I barely had time to process his hurried appearance before I noticed something drop from his pocket. A wallet. It landed with a soft thud on the pavement, lying there unnoticed as he kept running. Without thinking, I picked it up and called out, "Hey! You dropped your wallet!" My voice barely registered above the din of the street. He didn't stop. If anything, he seemed to run faster, his pace quickening with every step. I hesitated, glancing down at the worn leather wallet in my hand. It felt heavy, not just from the contents inside, but from the strange urgency of the situation. I couldn't just leave it there. With a sigh, I started jogging after him, hoping to catch up. "Hey, wait!" I shouted, weaving through the crowd as I tried to follow him. He was already several meters ahead, slipping between people with surprising ease. I picked up my pace, clutching the wallet tightly, determined to return it. As I ran, I noticed something odd. He kept glancing over his shoulder, not at me, but at something behind him. His movements were frantic, his head jerking from side to side as though he was searching for an escape. It was clear now that he wasn't just running, he was fleeing. The street began to thin out as he led me into a quieter part of the neighborhood. The buildings here were older, their facades crumbling, the sidewalks cracked and uneven. He darted down an alley, and I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should follow. But the wallet in my hand felt like a tether, pulling me forward. I turned into the alley just in time to see him disappear into an old house at the far end. Its windows were dark, the paint peeling from its weathered exterior. The front door hung slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the breeze. I stood at the threshold of the house, catching my breath as I debated what to do. The place felt wrong, like it had been forgotten by time. The faint smell of damp wood and mildew wafted out through the open door, mingling with the faintest trace of something metallic. "Hello?" I called out tentatively, stepping inside. My voice echoed in the stillness, the sound unnervingly loud. There was no answer. The hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit by the weak sunlight filtering through dusty, cracked windows. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I moved cautiously forward, clutching the wallet like a lifeline. Somewhere deeper in the house, I thought I heard movement, a faint shuffle, followed by a soft creak. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The house felt like a labyrinth, its narrow corridors twisting and turning with no clear end. Finally, I reached a door slightly ajar at the end of a hallway. The noise had stopped, but I knew he was in there. I pushed the door open slowly, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The man was crouched in the corner, his back against the wall and his eyes darting toward the doorway. He looked pale, his face slick with sweat, and his chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. His expression flickered between relief and fear as he saw me. "You found it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. His gaze dropped to the wallet in my hand, and for a moment the tension in his body seemed to ease. I stepped closer, holding it out to him. "You dropped this," I said, my voice low, unsure of what to make of his reaction. He took the wallet with trembling hands, muttering a quick thank you before shoving it into his jacket. But then his eyes snapped to mine, and his expression turned serious. "You shouldn't have followed me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to leave, now." "What's going on?" I asked, confused and a little shaken by the urgency in his tone. He hesitated, his eyes darting toward the hallway. "I'm being followed. Debts I couldn't pay. They're here, or they will be. You don't want to be around when they show up." The words sent a chill through me. Before I could respond, a sound echoed from deeper in the house, a low murmur like distant voices. The man's face drained of color. "Go," he hissed, waving me toward the door. "Now." The voices were faint at first, indistinct murmurs carried on the still air, but they grew louder with each passing second. My chest tightened as I strained to make out the words. They were close, too close. The man in the corner visibly tensed, his eyes darting toward the hallway like a trapped animal. "Leave," he whispered again, his voice urgent and raw. "You don't have time." I didn't need to be told twice. My instincts screamed at me to get out, but the creaking of floorboards in the distance made every direction feel like a trap. I stepped cautiously out of the room, glancing both ways down the dim hallway. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering faintly as if cast by a light just out of sight. The voices were clearer now, low and guttural, though the language was hard to discern. It sounded like more than one person, their tones cold and deliberate. I froze, trying to gauge where they were coming from. Then, unmistakably, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. Panic gripped me as I turned toward the back of the house. The hallway stretched into darkness, but it was my only option. I moved as quickly and quietly as I could, every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet sending a spike of adrenaline through my veins. The air grew colder the deeper I went, and the house seemed to close in around me, its walls narrowing like a maze designed to trap me. The footsteps behind me grew louder, joined by the low murmur of voices. My mind raced, trying to piece together who or what was pursuing the man, and now, inadvertently, me. I didn't dare look back. My only focus was finding a way out. Ahead, a door loomed, its paint peeling and the wood swollen from years of neglect. I pushed against it, but it didn't budge. My heart pounded as I tried again, this time with more force. The door groaned loudly, and for a moment, I was sure it would draw attention. Finally, it gave way, revealing a small, overgrown backyard bathed in the pale glow of a distant streetlight. I stumbled out, the cool night air hitting me like a wave of relief. I turned briefly to glance back at the house. The windows were dark, the shadows inside unmoving, but the voices were still there, faint and ominous, drifting from somewhere within. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted through the yard, pushing past tangled weeds and broken fence boards until I was back on the street. The street felt like another world compared to the suffocating stillness of the house. The familiar hum of distant traffic and the faint glow of streetlights offered a semblance of normalcy, but I couldn't shake the unease clinging to me. My chest heaved as I leaned against a lamppost, trying to catch my breath. I glanced back toward the house, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. The stillness was almost worse than the sounds I'd heard inside. What had happened to the man? Was he still inside, or had they found him? The thought sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me. I debated going back, calling for help, perhaps, but the warning in his voice echoed in my mind. You don't want to be around when they show up. He had been terrified, and now, so was I. I forced myself to walk away, my footsteps unsteady as I put as much distance as I could between myself and that house. My mind raced, replaying every detail of what had just happened. The man's fear, the voices, the ominous footsteps in the dark. I never found out what became of him or who was after him. Part of me wanted to know, to understand the danger I had narrowly escaped. But another part of me, the louder part, insisted I was better off leaving it behind. I've always appreciated routine. There's something calming about knowing exactly where you're going and how long it will take to get there. My route was no exception, an easy walk through a few familiar streets lined with neatly trimmed hedges, old trees arching over the pavement, and a scattering of small shops and cafes. It wasn't remarkable, but it was mine. Every landmark, every turn, every sign along the way was like an old friend. That morning started like any other. The air was crisp, the sky overcast but not threatening rain. I followed the same rhythm as always, feet automatically carrying me past the small bakery with its ever-present smell of fresh bread, the park where a few early joggers circled the path, and the faded green sign that marked the halfway point of my journey. But then, something caught my eye, a detour sign that hadn't been there before. I slowed down, squinting at it. It looked official enough. A bright orange placard propped on a metal frame, directing foot traffic down a side street. I hesitated. I'd never seen this sign before, but roadwork happened all the time, and it wasn't unusual for routes to change temporarily. Shrugging it off, I followed the new path, thinking little of it. The side street wasn't one I recognized, but at first it seemed harmless enough. It was narrower than my usual route, flanked by rows of aging houses with overgrown yards and peeling paint. The detour sign at the corner had pointed this way, and I figured it would loop back to my normal path eventually. Still, something felt off. The silence, maybe. No cars, no pedestrians, no hum of distant traffic, just the sound of my footsteps on the cracked pavement. I walked on, glancing around for another sign or any indication that I was heading the right way. The usual landmarks were gone, no familiar storefronts, no playgrounds or bus stops. Instead, the street seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, lined with identical houses and trees that looked too perfectly spaced, too uniform. After a while, I spotted another sign in the distance. Relief washed over me, but as I got closer, that relief turned to confusion. The sign wasn't like the others. It wasn't orange, and it didn't look official. It was a simple wooden arrow nailed to a post, pointing left down another narrow path. The lettering was crude, as though scrawled in haste. I paused, my unease growing. This wasn't part of any normal detour. But curiosity, or perhaps stubbornness, urged me forward. The new path was unsettlingly quiet. The houses had disappeared, replaced by a dense line of trees on either side, their branches arching overhead and casting everything in shadow. The pavement beneath my feet felt uneven, like it hadn't been maintained in years. I kept walking, hoping to see something familiar, a street lamp, a bench, anything. But the surroundings grew more desolate with every step. There were no sounds now, not even birds or the rustle of wind through the trees. The silence pressed against me, making every footstep echo unnaturally loud. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, though I couldn't explain why. Each time, the path behind me was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was there, just out of sight. Minutes turned to what felt like hours. I had no sense of how far I'd gone or how long I'd been walking. The path seemed endless, the scenery unchanging. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I just needed to keep going. This had to lead somewhere. That's when I first noticed it, the shadow. It wasn't much, just a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. I stopped abruptly, heart pounding, and turned to look. There was nothing there. The trees stood motionless, the path behind me stretching into darkness. Shaking my head, I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. Lack of sleep, maybe. Stress. But as I continued walking, it happened again. A faint shape flitting between the trees, just far enough away to be indistinct. My steps quickened, though I didn't dare break into a run. Something told me not to. The signs appeared more frequently now, wooden arrows pointing in different directions, some leading deeper into the woods, others back toward the path I'd come from. Each one looked more hurriedly made than the last, as though they'd been placed in a rush. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming now. Every hair on my body stood on end as I felt eyes on me from all sides. I glanced behind me one last time, hoping to catch whatever was out there, but the path was empty, silent. Yet I couldn't shake the certainty that I wasn't alone. I stopped walking and turned in a slow circle, studying my surroundings. The signs, they weren't guiding me anymore. They were leading me astray, deeper into this eerie, isolated place. My chest tightened as the truth sank in. I wasn't on a detour. I'd been manipulated, deliberately misled. But by who or what? The thought chilled me to the core. I retraced my steps, backtracking to the last sign. It pointed in 3 directions, each arrow scrawled in jagged, uneven letters. None of them led to familiar ground. I chose the one that seemed most promising. A path lined with smaller, younger trees that allowed more light to filter through. But as I walked, the oppressive silence grew heavier, and the path twisted unnaturally, looping back on itself. My heart raced as I realized I wasn't making any progress. The same crooked tree, with its bark split like a gaping wound, appeared over and over. I was going in circles. The signs weren't just misleading. They were a trap, forcing me deeper into the maze. My breath quickened, and I fought the rising urge to panic. If I couldn't trust the signs, how would I find my way out? The air felt thicker now, each breath more labored than the last. I abandoned the path entirely, veering into the underbrush, desperate to break free from whatever force was keeping me here. Twigs snapped beneath my feet, and branches clawed at my arms and legs as I pushed forward. The ground grew uneven, littered with roots that seemed to reach out and trip me at every step. I pressed on, ignoring the scrapes on my skin and the ache in my muscles. All that mattered was finding something familiar, a landmark that could anchor me to the real world. The deeper I went, the more distorted the environment became. The trees seemed to lean inward, their twisted branches creating a canopy that blocked out the light. The shadows moved unnaturally, shifting and writhing in the corners of my vision. And then I heard it. A sound. Faint but distinct. A low hum, like distant machinery. It was the first break in the oppressive silence, and it filled me with a sliver of hope. I followed the sound, stumbling through the dense forest until the trees began to thin. At last, I emerged into a clearing, and there it was, a familiar landmark, the edge of the park I knew so well. Relief surged through me as I stumbled onto the park's paved path. I turned back, expecting to see the dense forest I'd just escaped from, but it wasn't there. The trees now formed an orderly line, nothing like the chaotic maze I'd been trapped in. The path behind me appeared smooth and undisturbed, as though nothing unusual had happened. My legs trembled, but I forced myself to keep walking, my eyes darting nervously to the edges of the park. Everything felt off, even now. The air was too still, and the usual sounds of birds and distant traffic were absent. I reached the familiar street corner where my route usually began and froze. The detour sign was gone. In its place was an ordinary street sign, weathered but unremarkable. Had it ever been there at all? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching me, but the street was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something had led me down that path, and it had let me go. Why? The question churned in my mind as I walked the rest of the way home, my steps quick and uneven. I had always found comfort in the quiet of my home, tucked at the edge of a sleepy neighborhood where the streets stayed silent after sundown. My evenings were predictable: dinner, a book, and the occasional glance out the window at the dark, empty road. That's why the doorbell ringing at 2:13 a.m. startled me more than it should have. I sat upright in my chair, the soft glow of my lamp barely cutting through the shadows of the living room. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but curiosity, or perhaps a sense of duty, got the better of me. I pulled on my robe and padded to the door, the cold floor sharp against my feet. The porch light flickered on as I opened the door. The empty street stared back at me. No cars, no people. The only sound was the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. I stepped outside and glanced around, but nothing seemed out of place. My neighbors' houses were dark, their curtains drawn tight. I stood there for a moment longer before retreating inside, locking the door behind me. I chalked it up to kids playing a prank. Still, as I lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it had been off. The next night, I had almost forgotten about the strange interruption. The day had been uneventful, and I had settled into the same routine. But as I turned off the TV and prepared for bed, the doorbell rang again. This time I froze. The clock read 2:13 a.m., the exact time as before. My first thought was irritation. If this was a prank, it was a persistent one. But as I approached the door, my frustration gave way to unease. I peeked through the peephole, expecting to see someone lurking on the porch. It was empty. The porch light clicked on as I opened the door, spilling a soft glow onto the walkway. I stepped outside, scanning the yard and the street beyond. The quiet was suffocating. The air felt heavier somehow, pressing against my skin like a warning. I closed the door, turning both the lock and the deadbolt this time. I walked back to the living room and stood by the window, staring out into the night. My thoughts raced, but no explanation felt right. By the third night, I was on edge before the doorbell even rang. My chest tightened as the clock crept past midnight, and every small noise in the house felt amplified. When the chime echoed through the house again at 2:13 a.m., I was ready, or so I thought. This time, I grabbed a flashlight before heading to the door. As always, the porch was empty, but as I swept the beam of light across the walkway, something caught my eye. Faint, partial footprints in the dirt near the edge of my yard. I stepped closer, squinting to make sense of them. The prints were erratic, leading in nonsensical patterns. They circled the house in uneven loops, stopped abruptly in some spots, and started again in others. Some were far too large to be from a person. Others seemed to fade as though whoever made them had disappeared mid-step. I backed away, my pulse quickening. I locked the door again, securing the chain this time, and retreated to my bedroom. I couldn't explain what I had seen, and my mind spun with possibilities, none of them comforting. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The doorbell didn't just wake me anymore. It haunted me, an unspoken threat hanging in the air. During the day, I found myself double-checking the locks on every window and door, testing them to ensure they wouldn't budge. That evening, I installed extra locks on the back door and moved a chair under the front doorknob. I told myself it was overkill, but the unease wouldn't let me rest. I stayed awake, my ears straining for any sound outside the ordinary. When the doorbell rang that night, I didn't answer it. I sat in the dark, gripping the flashlight and staring at the front door. The chime echoed twice more before stopping, leaving only the oppressive silence. Then I heard something else, faint scratching at the back door, light and deliberate. I stayed where I was, my breath shallow. The scratching stopped after a few moments, replaced by the sound of something moving outside. The fear in my chest twisted into something heavier, something I couldn't name. I stayed awake until morning. The next night, I prepared myself. Every light in the house was off, save for the dim glow of a lamp in the living room. I sat on the couch, flashlight in hand, staring at the clock as it approached 2 a.m. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling. When the doorbell rang at 2:13 a.m., I didn't flinch. I stayed seated, listening intently for anything beyond the chime. My heart raced as I waited, each second dragging out. Then I heard it, the faintest scratching sound at the back of the house. It wasn't frantic, just deliberate, as though someone was testing the edge of the door. I stood slowly, moving toward the back of the house with the flashlight. My steps felt heavier with each one, the floor creaking underfoot. When I reached the back door, I hesitated, flashlight trembling in my grip. The scratching stopped. I turned on the light in the yard. Nothing. The emptiness felt mocking, as though it was daring me to come outside. Instead, I returned to the living room and spent the rest of the night staring at the front door, unable to shake the feeling that I was being toyed with. The next day, I barely left the house. I couldn't focus on anything. Work, meals, even basic chores seemed impossible. My mind replayed the sounds and the footprints, searching for answers that never came. By the time night fell, I was exhausted but too anxious to sleep. At 2 a.m., I turned off every light in the house and sat by the living room window, peering out into the yard. The minutes ticked by in agonizing silence. Then I saw it, just beyond the edge of my floodlights, a figure standing perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to see more clearly. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I turned on the floodlights, expecting it to reveal a person. Instead, the light illuminated nothing but the yard. The figure was gone. I stepped back from the window, shaking. When I finally mustered the courage to look again, the only evidence it had ever been there was a single footprint in the dirt, far from the house. I couldn't explain how or why it disappeared, but the sight left me reeling. That night, I didn't bother trying to sleep. I moved a chair to the center of the living room and sat with my flashlight and a kitchen knife, staring at the front door. Every sound felt like a threat. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant rustle of the wind outside. The doorbell didn't ring, but the silence was worse. Around 3 a.m., I began to hear faint whispers. They weren't coming from one place. They seemed to drift through the house, growing louder and softer without reason. I pressed my ear to the walls, desperate to locate the source, but the whispers always seemed just out of reach. By dawn, the whispers stopped. I was left with a gnawing sense of dread, the kind that settled deep into my chest and refused to leave. The house no longer felt like mine. It felt like a trap, something designed to keep me in. I woke up late the next morning, having fallen asleep in the chair. For a moment, I thought it was over. The sunlight streaming through the windows brought a brief, false sense of normalcy. But as I stepped outside to check the yard, my stomach dropped. There, in the dirt below my bedroom window, was a fresh set of footprints. They led directly up to the glass, pausing as if someone had stood there, watching me sleep. They didn't lead away. It was as though whoever had made them had simply vanished. The doorbell never rang again after that night, but the unease didn't leave. I moved out of the house within the month, unable to shake the feeling that whatever had been there wasn't finished with me. Even now, in my new apartment, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I'll hear that doorbell again.